Welcome everyone to Color Commentary. We are your Pauper commentators, Michael Petchick and Adrian Gonzalez. How's it going, Adrian?
Pretty good, Mike. How are you?
Doing all right. It's summertime. I'm relaxing, enjoying myself. I got no real complaints. I'm getting to record a podcast on Monday. World is working out all right today.
Sweet. I'm good too.
Wonderful. That's what I like to hear. Let's take care of some upkeep stuff so we can get into our discussion topic for this week. Does that sound good to you?
Yep, sounds great. We got a Patreon for just one episode. You can hear the full show, including our pre and post shows. We talk about a lot of other stuff. And you get Patreon exclusive access to our Discord channel. Super cool.
Yeah. We're also brought to you in part by Hipsters of the Coast. They are a content hub for all sorts of magic content, ranging from podcasts to articles, all sorts of cool stuff. So if you're looking for some magic stuff to read or listen to or engage with any of your other senses that are physically possible, go check them out and show them some love on social media so that they know that our fans are enjoying their other content. All right, Adrian. Last week, we talked about aggro and tempo decks in Pauper for our sort of reintroduction to the format. And this week we're continuing. So we're going to at least tackle mid-range and control decks. Time permitting, we'll see if we go further than that. But we're at least tackling those today.
We're going to try.
We're going to give it the old college try. And I think we might as well just dive in here. And starting off the mid-range lists, we have the white-black pestilence decks. And boy, howdy, am I happy to see this on our list of actually good decks for once.
It used to not be. It used to not be that great.
It used to be kind of trash.
But would you say that cards like what made this deck better? Was it cards like Thraben Inspector?
I think so. First off, there's sort of two distinct builds of this. There's the very creature-light version, and there's the more sort of mid-range core Skyfisher version. And for folks who are newer to the format, core Skyfisher is going to be the thread that runs through almost every mid-range deck in this format. So get familiar with the card. There's like the more mid-rangey the more creature-heavy version, and I think the big thing was like Thraben Inspector and cards like that certainly helped out the more mid-rangey version. I think honestly, a large part of it, people were kind of building the deck poorly, and I was guilty of this as well. Like, there were a bunch of bad cards that this deck used to run. Like, I have definitely seen versions of this list from back in the day that ran Disowned Ancestor. Are you familiar with that card?
Is that the black one that puts counters on itself?
Yes, and is an 0/4, and you ran it literally.
Yeah, that's a really bad card for constructed. It was great and limited. What is that mechanic called? You can only do it as a sorcery?
Outlast
Yeah,
for a single black. And yeah, it just wasn't that great. And like a lot of people get really cute with Wall of Hope, the 1 mana 0/3 that whenever it gets dealt damage, you gain that much life, as like this way to sort of offset the life loss that you'd accrue as a result of repeatedly activating Pestilence without like realizing that without Pestilence it's just kind of a bad card. I think that was the big issue, was like a lot of the older Pestilence decks were just kind of running a lot of not so great synergy that relied really heavily on getting Pestilence, and now I think people are building it a little bit more as a deck that's trying to do other things that also just happens to sort of run Pestilence as this game-ending whammy card. Like I rarely see these lists, except the really creature-light ones, still running for Guardian of the Guild Pact, because while the card is hard to kill, it doesn't do much. It's not like super great without Pestilence, but having it around for that is great. I think the other thing that really helped propel this deck was the adoption of Palace Sentinels in a lot of these lists.
100%. Being the Monarch is so key in a slow, grindy deck like this.
I was going to say, like, if you're a deck where your plan is to try and keep the board clear as much as possible on your opponent's side, being the Monarch is just a slam dunk.
Right. And so this deck's game plan is basically to 1-for-1 your opponent with discard spells like Castigate, which is, kind of like the Hotseas, Duress, even Divest, gas back up with Monarch and Night's Whisper and such, and eventually try and win the game with either a Pestilence and Guardian the Guild Pact or with Guardian the Guild Pact by itself. Would you say that that's accurate? Or yeah, you can with Pestilence. Yeah,
I mean, there is the more creature heavy version that has Core Skyfishers, even Rift Watchers. But it kind of does that tired and true, like, Pauper midrange has always been like, I've got a bunch of creatures with 2 power, some of them have evasion, and I just have a pile of removal and card draw. But yeah, like I'm looking through like a list here just sort of casually as we're talking about this, and like not having to run Sign in Blood certainly helps this deck, because I'm looking at this and like the fact that you don't have to reliably hit like double black really early in the game means that you'll be able to keep a wider array of hands and know that you'll have card draw down the line. And like there's also like cute little things. Like I've definitely seen lists that run I'm gonna completely blank on the name of this. The land that puts a creature from your graveyard back
Mortuary
on top.
Mire.
Thank you. Mortuary Mire and Core Skyfisher that just kind of gives you a perpetual creature, because you can bounce the Mortuary Mire, and when the Skyfisher dies, you can put it back on top of your library, blah, blah, blah.
The value.
And like this is definitely like sort of the very dirtily sort of mid-range where like none of the stuff you're doing is super, super impactful until it really is. And yeah, like you just get to play some of the best removal. Like you get to play Tragic Slip, you get to play Chainer's Edicts, I'm looking here, there's even a list running Raven's Crime. Like you just get to play like a very attrition oriented game. And
so if you like that,
yeah. Definitely something I enjoy, but it is not for everyone. I'm actually noticing that at this point it is actually MTG Goldfish is splitting the deck down the middle. It's actually classing half of them as black-white control, the more creature light versions. So interesting to see that those have actually diverged enough to start registering as different things. So where do you think this deck does really well?
I think it does well in and I think that's going to be true actually of a lot of the Monarch decks. Does very well in Tron light but creature deck heavy metas, because Pestilence is there to beat the creature decks. It might be a little bit too slow against elves, which is kind of a bummer. Well, good for elves, a bummer for this deck. But they have so many other ways of dealing with elves cards too that, yeah, I would say that if you're looking to kill a lot of creatures over the course of your tournament, this is definitely the deck you want to be playing.
Yeah, and especially like smaller creature decks. Like,
oh yeah, for sure.
Even something like Delver has enough like low toughness threats where a Resolved Pestilence is real bad for them a lot of the time, especially with like the number of lists we're seeing that have either for having multiple colors or just as a deck building decision have cut down or completely removed the number of Spire Golems. Once you cut those out, there's not a lot of high toughness creatures in that deck at all. And you can even, do the old trick where you can get around something with Undying. So even that, Stormbound Geist isn't a huge problem for you. Yeah, this is just a very solid control deck, and it's kind of or controlling mid-range. And
yeah, I would say it does lean more towards the control side because it typically is going to be playing the longer game. But I would say that it is a mid-rangey style strategy, especially if you're going with the more creature builds like you mentioned.
Yeah, I was going to say that any deck that is running 6 creatures is probably either a combo deck or a control deck just on the outset. And yeah, like Pestilence is a hell of a card, and if you can resolve it, sometimes it just ends games. Like, worst case scenario, it can just be a big old fireball. And best case scenario, you're up against elves, they haven't got enough on the board, and you can just keep wrathing their board over and over again. But yeah, this has become sort of a mainstay. I think, like, as with all of these mid-range decks, the number one thing that we have to say is, like, these decks are not good against specifically Tron.
Yeah, that's really the thing. And I've even resolved Monarch versus Tron and everything right and still lost. Granted, not with this deck. This deck might fare a little bit better because of all the main deck hand attack cards. But yeah, these decks typically have a very miserable matchup against Tron specifically.
Yeah, and it's generally just the fact that, like, Tron can do bigger things. Not necessarily better, but frequently kind of better.
Right, they just bury you in the mana.
Yeah. Like, digging for a removal spell against, like, resolved threats or combo pieces is not a position you kind of want to find yourself in. But yeah, this is White Black Pestilence. This deck used to be trash. It isn't trash anymore, and I would highly recommend checking it out. It's a super fun and interactive deck. I think that's definitely, like, the best thing I can say for this. Like, if you want a deck where you're going to interact a lot, and especially, as you mentioned, Adrian, like, creature heavy metas, this deck is a blast to play in that specific situation. All right, next up, and we're going to kind of straddle a gap here with these two lists. You've put in the time with these. It's the red-white list. It's Bully and Monarch.
So, to be fair, I actually have not played a lot of Bully.
That's fair.
I mostly have played Monarch, but, you know, like you said, the lines are super duper blurred. If you just go to Boros on Goldfish, for example, like, the Monarch deck is playing Faithless Looting, and and the deck looks like it's just called Koldatha Boros.
Yeah, these.
Oh, there's also a WR.
Yeah,
which is okay.
It's real difficult to draw a line here.
Yeah, so I guess what we could do is we could divide it. Well, and then there's even this third one here, because I think this is actually a Methodical deck. A Methodical, or at least that deck plays. Sorry, I'm getting way ahead of myself. So basically, at their core, the red-white decks have evolved a lot over time. So I'm just going to go ahead and do, like, a brief little history here. First, they were a token type deck. They were playing a card called Koldatha Rebirth, which is why they're called Koldatha Boros initially. And the goal of the game was to use Core Skyfisher to loop artifacts that draw you a card, like Prophetic Prism, to keep a card advantage engine going to help you keep parity with blue. And eventually win the game with all these tokens. It had an extremely good creature matchup against specifically Stompy, because we had like 8 burn spells and prismatic strands. Well, then Palace Sentinels got printed, and the deck became a Monarch deck. Monarchy entered the format, and it became all about becoming the Monarch, and it sort of shifted gears a little to protect the crown. Slotted in Palace Sentinels, and I thought, wow, this deck is just like the best deck in the format. I had a lot of success with it. Now we still have the Monarch deck, but now there's these 2 other sub decks. There's the Methodical style deck, which I just mentioned, that's playing cards like, and he really pioneered this, like Searing Blaze and Seeker of the Way, so that you're a little bit more aggressive, and so that buying those artifacts pump the Seeker. And then there's also the Deluxekoff version, which is looking to fill the graveyard with cards like Rally the Peasants and Battle Screech, so that you just generate tons of card advantage off of Faithless Looting, and it's more of like a beatdown strategy in the vein of the earlier Koldatha Boros decks back when they were still tokens decks. Do you think I explained that well enough so far, Mike?
Yeah, I think that's all tracking. And, like, these come from, like, a long lineage within Pauper, where back in the day, like, these decks were frequently Jeskai because they didn't have great card advantage, and they'd splash blue for, like, Muldrifter and other card draw effects.
Right. And back then we thought they were trash.
Yeah, they were a little all over the place. Three color decks are a little sketchy at times in Pauper.
Well, and so there's actually even yet another twist that has recently come out with these decks, which is that they all play Arkham's Astrolabe, which is a new card that costs a snow mana, but it has the same effect as Prophetic Prism in that it draws you a card and you can use it to filter mana. So this is just awesome because by slightly tweaking the mana base, you no longer have to run cards like Oh, what is the card that you sacrifice so a creature can't attack or block?
Oh,
It's another 2 mana
Alchemist File.
Yeah, Alchemist File. So now you have a 1 mana option as well. So yeah, Arkham's Astrolabe I think has done a ton of work in the format.
Yeah, and we're now kind of at this interesting point where a lot of people have been experimenting with that card, and we're starting to see like a variety of options, and we'll cover more of them as we go. But like, yeah, like there's straight up results for 4-color takes on this deck where you still have the core Skyfisher engine paired with Arkham's Astrolabe, but people have gone pretty deep on it because we don't have any dual lands that produce snow mana. So you can go super deep on basics and you wind up with these sort of funky looking decks that are running 4 colors worth of basics and kind of hoping to string it together with Arkham's Astrolabe so that you have access to the colors of mana when you need it. And I think time will tell on those. It's still very early days. Like, what, Modern Horizons came out like 2 weeks ago at this point, so we don't really have sort of a plurality of data yet on that particular take on the deck. But
it's definitely very popular card right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's new toy syndrome, right? Like, we have this new thing in the format. It looks like a card that is proven time and time again is worth playing in our format and mid-range decks. And it kind of just tracks for me that people would be trying out this new thing because it's similar to the old thing that was good, so might as well try and figure out how it works. I mean, we're even seeing like some of the just straight up red-white decks running Arkham's Astrolabe alongside Prophetic Prism.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that's fine.
Yeah. I mean, like, you're seeing like 10, maybe 11 Snowlands.
So let's talk about where these decks are good also, because I think they actually are good at different things. I actually think that the tokens version, the bully version, although originally designed to bully Delver, actually might have the best Tron matchup just because it's the fastest. Like, the other problem with these decks is that they're so slow. They just give Tron infinite time basically to build up their hand, build up their board. So what do you think about that? I think that deck in particular is the best of the bunch to fight Tron.
Yeah, I think because we kind of see this like spectrum of options where you've got like bully and the version with Seeker of the Way sort of at the more lean, aggressive end of things. That, yeah, as you said, is definitely going to be a little bit better against Tron, because Tron is, at the end of the day, while I know it definitely feels like when you're playing against it, they always have like natural Tron, or like their cards just line up perfectly. It can definitely feel like that. It is a little bit of a rickety deck. Like, it does require a reasonable amount of luck with your draws, and you can definitely punish it just by presenting a reasonable clock. And I think those decks are better at that than the more Monarch focused version. I think like the Monarch version is much better against other aggro decks.
Yes, I think I agree, because and it also, I think, was pretty good at going toe-to-toe with Delver because of the consistent card advantage, even though you had to be very careful of their flyers. In fact, it got to the point even where people were main decking like Trickery.
Yeah, and thankfully we've peeled back a little bit from there. But I think the other interesting thing is sort of this delicate balance of Galvanic Blast, because that is, I think, another great reason to play this deck. So for folks at home, Galvanic Blast is a red for an instant, deals 2 damage to any target. If you have Metalcraft, so 3 or more artifacts in play, it deals 4 instead. And this really like a full playset of this, if you can support it and reliably be able to have Metalcraft turned on, does represent 16 points of damage. Like,
yeah, it's one of, if not the best burn spell, but with a huge deck building restriction.
Yeah, and now we're kind of seeing this odd, like, delicate dance where people are having to peel back on the number of artifact lands they're playing so that they can enable their Astrolabes, and as a result, you're kind of in this weird place where Astrolabe is an artifact, but it's not a land, and I don't know. It's a very tricky balance. and people are still sort of working that one out. And time will tell where exactly the more traditional version of this falls, but yeah, this is if I had to point to like sort of the truest mid-range deck in the format, I'd point to something like the Monarch build of this. Like, that is definitely the one where it is hoping to play a long game, and it is hoping that its cards are better than your cards. And for me, that is exactly what I think of when I think of mid-range. I guess out of the current configurations, which one would you suggest to someone? If they're just like, what's the difference between these decks? Which one should I play?
I would say, do you want to beat Tron or do you want to beat the creature decks?
That's fair.
And then go from there.
No. That's a completely legit point to make. But yeah, this is a tired and true thing. So yeah, pick up some core Skyfishers and go to town. You can play around with it. And while we're on the topic of Arkham's Astrolabe, we're gonna just kind of gently segue on in to control decks, and we're gonna talk about Tron, the big control menace, at least for the past like 2 years.
Everyone's very scared of Tron.
Yeah, I mean, so for folks at home who perhaps haven't played Modern, the Tron lands are a cycle of 3 lands: Power Plant, Urza's Power Plant, Urza's Mine, and Urza's Tower. And each one of them taps for a colorless, but when you have all 3 of them, Mine and Power Plant tap for 2 colorless, and Tower taps for 3 colorless. So as long as you have all 3, they collectively tap for 7 mana. And I think the big thing, first off, if you have played Modern, Adrian, how much does this deck share in common with like the modern version of Tron?
Oh, absolutely nothing. Whereas the modern, I mean, the lands.
Yeah.
But whereas Tron in other formats is looking to play big colorless threats or big threats in general, Tron is really a control deck in our format, and like truly a control deck, like counter spells, convoluted win conditions.
Oh yeah. Like it is seeking to leverage that mana advantage into just being able to double spell more frequently than its opponent. And the reason that we're kind of using this as a segue is this deck for ages has played a full play set of Prophetic Prisms, and now people are testing out Arkham's Astrolabe in this deck, because one of the big deck building restrictions with these types of decks is you have to pretty much devote 12 slots to the Urza lands. Like, there's not a lot of wiggle room there. And as a result, you don't get that many basics, and people are still giving it the old college try. Like, there was a deck recently that showed up in the Pauper Challenge and did incredibly well, clocking in at a 7-0 on the day. That is technically, if you look at the land base, pretty much mono blue Tron, but it's doing that so that it can run 4 Arkham's Astrolabe, 4 Prophetic Prisms, to then enable a Dinrova horror based flicker combo.
The carnage.
The absolute carnage. But yeah, this is a deck where Tron is more sort of incidentally like, oh, okay, I've got Tron online. Cool. I can now do a lot more than you can. And also I can just like casually play Rolling Thunder as a way to just sometimes dome my opponent out. So that is one version of the deck. There have been many versions of Tron over the years, and sort of the one that has been here the longest, I think, is that fair to say, is Marasatron?
Yeah, but what does that even really mean anymore? Can you explain?
Yeah, so back when Peregrine Drake left the format in, oh god, was that 2016? That sounds about right.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah.
Like a couple years ago.
We'll go with 2016. If we're wrong, I'm sure someone will let us know. After Peregrine Drake left the format, there was sort of this void, and one of the decks that started showing up was a Tron deck that ran the recently at the time released Pulse of Marasa, which is 2 and a green for an instant. Return a creature or land from a graveyard to its owner's hand. You gain 6 life, which seems very innocuous, but it turns out when your game plan is trying to be a dirtily control deck that people sometimes side in land hate against, Pulse of Marasa does work. And
yeah, it was like, I think you described it at the time as 2 not great things that do one great thing together.
Yeah, this is one of those cards where like no part of this card is worth a card, but together it is just good enough. And specifically, like sort of the level 1 sort of realization is like, oh, okay, I play Mnemonic Wall in this deck, and if I can keep blocking something with Mnemonic Wall, I can just keep getting it back with Pulse of Marasa, and then I can use Mnemonic Wall to get back my Pulse of Marasa, so I can just kind of have this situation where my opponent doesn't want to attack into my Mnemonic Wall. And I can use that to, sort of dirtle around and set up a win condition. And over time, we sort of saw this evolution where after Modern Masters 2017 hit, and we saw the downshift of Dinrova Horror, the 4 blue black 4/4. When it enters the battlefield, return a permanent to its owner's hand, then that player discards a card. We started seeing people go, okay, well, we're already running Mnemonic Wall, we can run Ghostly Flicker, and that means that we were already running Muldrifter, so we can now have flicker loops where we flicker Mnemonic Wall and a Muldrifter to draw more cards. We can have flicker loops where we flicker Mnemonic Wall and Dinrova Horror and just slowly basically capsize lock our opponent without having to play capsize, and then beat them to death with a 4/4. And you wound up seeing a lot of weird variants come out, because then there's sort of this evolution where you had Stonehorn Dignitary, the 4-mana white creature that when it ETBs forces an opponent to skip their next combat step. But yeah, like constantly throughout this, there's kind of been this backbone of like playing some quantity of Mystical Teachings, some quantity of Pulse of Marasa, and Mnemonic Wall, and then sort of building out from there. And one of the things is you're always kind of, as a result of a lot of restrictions with the deck and how you're sort of limited in your slots, you're going to wind up running very sort of singleton removal. And the deck has varied over the years, where there were versions at one point that ran even Car's Justice. There were versions at one point that ran like a bunch of lightning bolts. There have been a whole ton of takes on this deck, and it's really interesting to sort of see that it's kind of morphed into this big old amorphous blob that you can't really pin down exactly. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's weird because, as you pointed out, like I said, Marasatron, and like your immediate gut reaction was like, what does that mean?
Yeah, it goes into so many Tron decks now.
Yeah, and
but generally you're right. It involves some sort of flicker loop. It involves maybe Rolling Thunder. It involves Pulse Marasa, and it involves Mnemonic Wall.
Yeah, and sort of this has become like where Flicker, outside of a combo deck that we will be getting to at a later point, this has sort of become the home for Ghostly Flicker, because even if you can't do it infinite times, Tron mana still lets you do it a whole bunch. Like if you casually, as the Tron player, have 9 mana and a Ghostly Flicker, a Mnemonic Wall, and Dinrova Horror, like on your opponent's upkeep, you can just casually like return 3 things to their hand and make them pitch cards. It is a silly deck that does silly big mana things. And I don't like. All right. So let's talk about matchups and
mashups.
Mashups. So there you go. Combinations of other things, but as in terms of matchups, I would say like this is the deck that eats mid-range decks for breakfast.
Yes, agree. It's pretty tough for them to beat Tron, even with a good draw.
Yeah, and I think like notably, this is a deck that can, depending on draws and depending on the exact way you've built the deck, can occasionally have a tough time against certain combo decks. Definitely like the fact that you're not running that much removal or that many counter spells can sort of hamstring you in certain matchups. And also just like applying pressure to this with an aggro deck is sometimes really hard for them to deal with. Like, this is a pretty creature light deck. A lot of these decks are running like at the upper bound, maybe like 10, maybe like 12 to 14 creatures as like sort of the upper limits. And like, sure, you can cast Seagate Oracles, but if your opponent just keeps hitting 2/2s and stuff, eventually you're not going to be able to keep up with that. And we kind of saw a while back, we saw decks that were running some quantity of Moments Peace, the fog with flashback, just as sort of a way to prevent themselves from auto losing to aggro decks. I think the big thing that if there's anything you're going to take away from this, there's a lot of ways to build this deck, and if this is something that interests you, build it the way that is comfortable for you.
Yeah, that's one of the great things is that it's very, very customizable, so that you can really kind of play whatever you want. It's sort of like the blue stew of Pauper.
There you go. That's a beautiful way to put it. Yeah, as long as you're not, as long as you don't have too many colored pips on your spells, you're pretty much fine. Like, do you want to play Condescend? Sure, you can play Condescend. You're a big mana deck. Do you want to play Crop Rotation to hit your Tron pieces quicker? Sure, you can do that. You know, do you want to play Compulsive Research as your draw engine, or do you want to play something like the recently released Reign of Revelation? Do you want to go heavy on the Ghostly Flicker thing, or do you just kind of want to have it there as your backup plan? Like, maybe, oops, I Mystical Teachings into the Ghostly Flicker, and now we're going to try and lock our opponent out. Do you want to play a bunch of dual lands, or do you want to play snow lands and try and make Astrolabe work? Or even, do you want to play some Signets? There's a lot of choices to be made here. The one thing is, though, like, I think another strength of the deck is just the fact that since you're running all of this fixing in the form of at least Prophetic Prisms, you do kind of get to run whatever you want in the sideboard. So you do get some pretty good answers, and the other thing is you get silly things like, have you ever had to play against Coalition Honor Guard?
That's the flag bearer. That's a 2/4.
Yeah.
Yeah, that card is annoying.
It's a flag bearer that conveniently doesn't die to like doesn't die to a strong breeze, basically. Yeah, that is a doozy of a sideboard card. I have definitely resolved that against Burn and just felt real great about myself. But yeah, Tron, real neat. We cannot possibly cover all the variants because just off the top of my head, I can also think of like, there's Aristic Circle Tron. There's, I'm sure there's the Big Dumb Creatures Tron. There's, the traditional Teamer Tron from way back in the day that doesn't see that much play anymore. Like, pick out something you want to do that requires big mana, and you can probably make Tron do it. As long as it's not a bunch of colored mana, you're probably fine. Do you have any other thoughts on Tron as a deck?
Yeah, it's cool.
All right. So, continuing on a control thing, and this is arguably, from time to time, has not been a control deck. Adrian, do you want to give folks sort of an eagle's eye view of the backstory of mono black control?
Sure. Yeah, it used to be one of the best decks in the format. It was feared by all, mostly because the format was a hair slower back then. For whatever reason. Also, it had access to great removal spells and very efficient creatures. Most of the creatures draw you a card or make your opponent do something, like discard a card or put it on top of the library. And then it would win with a card called Grey Merchant of Asphodel, which would just drain you for all of its black pips.
Yeah.
So when did it start getting bad?
Well, I think the first thing that did it in was when when Peregrine Drake showed up. Like,
Yes.
one of the big issues was the deck's removal suite didn't particularly line up very well against a deck that could just win out of nowhere. And especially a deck that could flicker its key payloads in response to your removal. And I think that was kind of the first thing that pushed it down. And then I feel like it just never got its footing back after Drake left the format. And I'm not 100% sure. I think it was kind of the fact that, like, at the end of the day, like, Grey Merchant is really good, but a lot of the things that surround it are just sort of these conditional minor card advantage Grey Ogres. And I think that Pauper kind of moved past that as being something that it couldn't deal with anymore. Because, and I think another thing that showed up was right around that time after the bannings, we saw people playing around with the Chittering Rats Ratlock deck. And I think that also sort of took some of the wind out of its sails. I think it was just one of those things where people realized that after Drake, we had new cards to play with, and no one ever really returned to it. But now we're starting to see the deck on the upswing again.
Yeah. The newest innovation to the deck is definitely playing Deemer Guildmage. Is that the right one?
Yes, that is
Yeah,
one of the tech pieces.
And some of them are even splashing blue so that they can use its activated ability to draw cards. It can either draw you a card or make your opponent discard a card as a sorcery. So splashing blue in cases like Deemer Aqueduct or Dismal Backwater isn't super awful. Some people would say that doesn't make it that makes it not mono black. I would, digress.
It still has it's got the core spirit of what the deck is trying to do.
Right. Just like we've said in the past, Jund is probably not black, green, and red in Pauper.
Yeah. I mean, I've definitely heard people refer to this as the Jund of Pauper just because it's a bunch of mid-rangey things at reasonable prices.
Yeah.
And recently they got a little bit of an upgraded piece of tech here in the form of Defile, the single black mana instant. Target creature gets -1/-1 until end of turn for each swamp you control. So sort of giving it a similar thing to Skred. Do you think maybe that's part of the reason why this deck went away, was that people figured out that Skred Delver existed and just kind of played the slightly more mid-rangey tempo thing? I don't know. It's just, it's weird to me that, and we definitely did episodes where we talked about, like, hey, where did this deck go? I don't know.
Have you seen me?
And certainly one of the other things is, like, there is a barrier to entry, especially in Paper, when it comes to a certain card in this list. We're talking about
Oubliette.
We're talking about Oubliette, yeah. The one black for something that is very similar but legally distinct from Journey to Nowhere, I think is a reasonable way to put it. It's basically Journey to Nowhere.
We got the pip. You got extra pips.
Exactly.
We got the pips.
Yeah, you get 2 pips for Grey Merchant, and the big catch here is looking at prices right now. 2 of those is going to run you like $70. So certainly not the most affordable deck in some configurations in Paper, but I don't know. This is one of those decks where I have fond memories of it because it did used to be a very good, like, solid tier 1 deck. Do you think we've just sort of moved past this as a format and, like, it's kind of having its last hurrah?
So we've talked about some of the other mid-range decks here. I think they just do what Mono Black wants to do better. Like, the card advantage is there, but also the removal goes face because you have the burn spells. But, like, you have the card advantage, you have the way to maintain your board presence, which is really what this deck was trying to do. This is kind of the most Hearthstone-y deck, right? You want to, like, control the board and then go face.
Okay. So okay, yeah, I can kind of see that. Like, is Galvanic Blast just a better version of Grey Merchant?
Yeah, because it always does 4 damage. So I just think that burning them out became more relevant than what Mono Black was trying to do. So I think that even though it does it differently, I think the Monarch decks have largely supplanted it, even though Mono Black is also technically a Monarch deck now.
Yeah, and I do think that was part of I think that might actually be the only reason that this deck is seeing a modicum of a comeback, is the fact that
Monarch's so strong.
Yeah, like a persistent source of card advantage in a removal heavy deck is a pretty solid game plan. Like if all of your cards are just fine, but you draw 2 of them a turn, in the long game you're probably going to win that game. And
right.
I think that is where this deck succeeds. But I think like if we had not had Thorn of the Black Rose in the format, I don't think this deck would be able to, like, even with Dimir Guildmage, it's not doing half of what it's currently doing. And yeah, like, I think the other thing is, like, do you want to be playing Kumbaj Witches in this format anymore? Like, it's great against Delver, but...
And Elves.
And Elves, yeah. I mean, like, even against Elves, though, like, if like, God forbid you're on the draw, like, if this is your turn 2, like, they will have had their turn 3. They could have gone wide enough at that point that you're in trouble. Like, I don't know. It's just a lot of these cards are solid in sort of in isolation, but when they come together, it's just kind of like, okay, this is a mid-range deck. Sure, I guess. Like, I understand what it's trying to do. It's just not thrilling. Although, boy, howdy, am I sure glad to not see Corrupt anywhere in most of these lists. That was always one of the things in older versions of this deck where I was just like, I don't think this card is good, but it sure does sometimes just kill people out of nowhere. So yeah, this is, it's a mid-rangey, slightly more controlling end of mid-range sort of deck. It will do well where mid-range does well. It preys on creature decks. It does poorly when control decks go taller than it. Do you have any other thoughts on this deck?
Now I'm ready for the next one.
Well, here's the thing. The rest of the decks we have here are combo decks, and we're coming up on around the same time that we had last week. So I'm thinking maybe we leave the combo decks for their own episode so I can at least try and figure out how all of these work.
Okay, yeah, sure. Cool.
Yeah, so just sort of as a recap, like, all of the decks we talked about, like, I know we may have sounded a little bit down on Mono Black, but all the decks we talked about are pretty solid.
Are viable.
Decks. Yeah.
Yeah. I even think Mono Black's viable. So, you gotta acknowledge that the metagame is what it is, but Pauper's like a lot of other formats, and that tier 2 decks can still win, and I wouldn't say Mono Black is like unplayable. It can win. It's definitely a fine choice. I just wouldn't put it in the same camp as some of the other decks we've discussed today. But if Mono Black's your thing, like one of my close personal friends here played Mono Black for a long time and had a lot of success with it, even back when people thought it wasn't very good. So I'm not trying to say the deck can't be teched or the deck is literally unplayable.
Yeah, it's definitely, you might have to put in a bit more work. And I think also for, like, Tron, that is another deck where, like, the longer you are willing to sit with that deck and think a lot about how you want to build that deck, because that is a deck that wins on a very slim margin. It has to just last just barely long enough to turn that corner. That's another deck where, like, spend time, like, sit down. Like, I would not recommend it as a deck for someone who's just getting into the format. Take a moment, figure out what your local metagame or the online metagame is doing, and adjust accordingly, and adjust heavily and frequently. But I don't want this to become like you see the truly refined player just plays control because it's the big brain 300 IQ sort of style of play. But it is a deck that by nature is making getting its wins by a very slim margin. So it's going to take a little bit longer to get used to, and it's going to take a little bit more time to like tune perfectly. And you're probably never going to be 100% happy with it. But I think the Monarch decks are all pretty solid. I feel like most of the lists that are doing well, or excuse me, the Boros decks, I feel like if you just pick out any deck that either 5-0'd a league or did reasonably well in the top 32 of a challenge, I feel like those are pretty solid decks. I feel like you can just pick one of those and like play a couple of practice games with it, and you'll probably feel pretty comfortable with it. But yeah, that is our episode on control and mid-range decks for Pauper. We will be off next week because I'm taking a vacation. I'm going and like doing things besides work.
He's gonna go longboard.
Yeah, I'm going to the wonderful, wonderful state of California. But we will be back in the second week of July to finish this off with combo. And you know what? Maybe anything that we realize over the next 2 weeks we've forgotten. There's a chance some of them slip through, but if we think about anything else that we want to include on this list, we might have the assorted selection at the end of it all. Yeah. The miscellaneous. Also, as a result of me not being here next week, our M20 set review is currently looking a little light, but you never know. We may have a combo of that and the finishing up of the Reintroduction to Pauper series. So stay tuned. A set review will come. We just don't know all the details, and we just know it won't be next week. All right.
Yeah, and that's okay. Okay.
Yeah. I from what we have seen so far, set looks fine. Just not any real great gifts for Pauper. So I don't think it's going to be the end of the world if we don't get to it absolutely immediately. All right. Do you have any other closing words for this evening, or are you ready to take us out of this show, Adrian?
I'll take us out. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. This podcast is brought to one of our patrons, including Job. Thank you, Job. You've been with us for a long time. Please consider supporting us as well if you like the show. Check below this video or the description of this podcast for details on where to find us. We'd like to remind you that if you listen to this on a platform with reviews, they are always appreciated as they boost our visibility. If you've got a deck list and idea for a topic, you can contact us either via our website or you can email us directly at colorcommentary@gmail.com. Special thanks to my LGS Pats Games, Mike's LGS JP Comics, and of course L. You can find our theme song Quantitative and other great tracks over at soundcloud.net/ELLELLELL. Till next week, this is Adrian and Mike, and we are signing off. Well, 2 weeks from now, this is Adrian and Mike, and we are signing off for Color Commentary.